The letter slipped from David's fingers and landed face down on the kitchen floor. He didn't pick it up right away. Instead, he stood there in his uniform, mail satchel still over his shoulder, snow melting off his boots into a thin, dirty puddle. The clock above the sink ticked louder than it should have. Every second felt like it was counting against him. "Not yet," David whispered, though no one had said anything out loud. Charlie sat a few feet away, tail thumping once, then stopping, as if the dog sensed this wasn't the kind of moment to interrupt. David finally bent down, knees stiff, and turned the envelope over. Final notice sat at the top in bold, impersonal letters. 67 years old. 42 years delivering other people's mail. And this was his. His chest tightened, not with panic, but with something heavier, recognition. Like part of him had been expecting this letter for a long time. He carried it to the table and sat down slowly. His hands, usually steady even in winter cold, trembled just enough to notice. Outside the window, Denver was gray and quiet, the kind of afternoon where the city felt paused, like it was holding its breath. David stared at the paper without reading the rest. Because he already knew the ending. All his life, he had believed in simple math: show up every day, do your job, don't complain, and things would eventually balance out. He had walked the same routes through sun, hail, and snowstorms that turned fingers numb within minutes. He had memorized porches, dogs, broken steps, and which houses needed an extra knock because someone inside moved slowly. He had never been late. But lately, a different calculation had started to creep in, quiet, unwelcome. What if effort isn't the same as progress? The thought made his jaw tighten. Barbara's car wasn't in the driveway yet. That gave him a few minutes. Time to breathe. Time to pretend this was just another piece of mail that didn't belong to him. He folded the letter once. Then again. Neat edges. Muscle memory. Charlie stood and walked over, resting his head against David's knee. "I know," David said softly, his voice steadier than he felt. "I know." On the counter sat another envelope, unopened, addressed in his son's handwriting. Kevin had dropped it off last week, said it was nothing important. David hadn't opened that one either. Somewhere deep inside him, a quiet fear shifted, not sharp, not loud, but dangerous all the same. The fear that this wasn't a bad moment. It was the moment when everything he'd been patient for finally ran out. Barbara came home just after 6. David heard the garage door lift, then the familiar shuffle of keys, the soft thud of her purse landing on the counter. He stayed seated at the table, the folded letter still beside his mug, untouched. "You're quiet," Barbara said, hanging up her coat. "Rough route?" "Long," David replied. Not a lie. Just not the whole truth. She noticed the letter immediately. Barbara always noticed things like that, small changes, objects out of place, silences that lasted a second too long. "What's that?" she asked. David hesitated, then slid it across the table. "Came today." She read it standing up. Once. Then again, slower. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were calm, but too calm, the way they got when she was already bracing herself. "How long?" she asked. 30 days. Barbara sat down carefully, as if sudden movement might make the words real. "And the savings?" David shook his head. "Won't stretch that far." Silence settled between them. Not hostile. Familiar. They'd practiced it over decades, through layoffs, medical bills, the year Kevin moved back home angry and broke. "We can call Kevin," Barbara said gently. David's shoulders stiffened. "No. David. He's got his own problems," David said, too quickly. "I won't add mine." Barbara studied him. "You already are. Just by not saying anything." That landed harder than the letter. Later, David stood at the sink washing the same mug twice. His reflection in the window looked thinner somehow. Older. Like the man staring back had already accepted something David wasn't ready to name. From the hallway, Barbara's voice floated out. There was another letter today. David's hands froze in the water. Another? From Kevin. His stomach tightened. What does he want? Barbara hesitated. He didn't say. Just asked us to read it together. David turned off the faucet and dried his hands slowly, deliberately. He didn't trust himself to move faster. The envelope lay on the coffee table now. Kevin's handwriting was careful. Too careful. David sat. Charlie settled at his feet, heavy and warm. Whatever it is, Barbara said quietly, we'll face it. David nodded, but didn't open the envelope yet. Not because he was afraid of bad news, but because a part of him feared something worse. Hope. The letter from Kevin was only one page. David knew that because he unfolded it slowly, carefully, as if length alone could tell him how much damage it might do. It didn't. The words did. Dad. I didn't want to say this out loud because I didn't want it to sound like pressure. David stopped there. Folded the paper back once. His chest tightened in a way he recognized immediately, not fear, not anger. Guilt. Barbara waited. She didn't rush him. She never did. David opened the letter again. Kevin wrote about work being unstable. About a contract that might not renew. About a family he was trying to hold together while pretending everything was fine. And then, halfway down the page, the sentence David couldn't get past. I may need help soon. Just temporarily. I wouldn't ask if there was another way. David stared at the words until they blurred. All his life, his greatest pride had been simple, my son won't have to carry what I carried. And now? I failed him, David said quietly. Barbara looked at him sharply. No. He's asking because I didn't leave him enough, David replied. I should have done better. Saved more. Planned. You showed up, Barbara said, firm now. Every day. That counts. David shook his head. It doesn't pay bills. That night, David lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the house. Charlie slept curled against his legs, steady and trusting. David envied that certainty. In the dark, the numbers ran through his mind. 30 days. Maybe less. Rent. Utilities. Kevin. Pride. And then another thought surfaced, one he'd kept buried for years. The pension paperwork. He hadn't told Barbara everything. Not about the small clause he'd ignored back when retirement felt distant. Not about the decision he'd made quietly, believing he was being responsible. He could access part of it early. At a cost. A permanent reduction. Smaller checks. Less later. Much less. It would solve the immediate problem. And quietly erase the future. David sat up in bed, heart pounding. This was the choice he'd been avoiding. The one hidden beneath routine and patience. Save today by sacrificing tomorrow. Or risk everything by waiting. In the kitchen, long after midnight, David stood at the counter with the pension folder open, pages spread like a confession. His finger traced the numbers. He thought of Barbara. Of Kevin's careful handwriting. Of Charlie's steady presence. He closed the folder without signing anything. Outside, Denver slept under a thin layer of snow. And somewhere between fear and faith, David made a decision he couldn't undo. The call came the next morning, just after David finished his route. He was back at the sorting center, emptying his satchel into its familiar metal bin, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. Unknown number. Denver area code. He stared at it longer than necessary. Hello, he said. Mr. Jones? The woman's voice was calm, professional. This is the Retirement Services office. We received an inquiry tied to your pension account. David's pulse jumped. I haven't submitted anything. Yes, she said. That's why I'm calling. There's been a review. A clerical discrepancy from several years ago. We need to meet in person. A pause. It's time-sensitive. David closed his eyes. How time-sensitive? He asked. Today, if possible. The office was small and overly bright, the kind of place where people whispered even when no one asked them to. David sat across from the woman as she slid a thin folder toward him. This isn't common, she said, tapping the cover. But it does happen. Inside were forms he vaguely recognized. Dates from nearly 15 years ago. A temporary assignment. Extra miles walked. Overtime logged during a winter when half the city had shut down. David frowned. I remember that winter. You filed for standard compensation, the woman said. But due to a system error, a supplemental credit was never applied. It compounded annually. She turned the page. David's breath caught. The number wasn't enormous. It wasn't miraculous. But it was real. And it was enough to change the math. Enough to stop the notice. Enough to help Kevin, quietly. Enough to avoid destroying the future he'd been guarding all night. This is, owed to me? David asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Yes, she replied. It always was. He signed the paperwork with a hand that felt strangely light. At home, Barbara listened without interrupting as he explained. When he finished, she covered her mouth with her hand and laughed, a short, breathless sound that collapsed into tears. All that time, she said. You never complained. David shook his head. I didn't know I was missing anything. That evening, David called Kevin. I can help, he said simply. No strings. There was silence on the line. Then his son exhaled. Dad, Kevin said quietly. I didn't want to ask because I didn't want you to sacrifice. David looked at the pension folder on the table. Closed. Untouched. I didn't, he said. I waited. After the call, David sat alone with Charlie at his feet, the house filled with the low hum of evening. The fear that had been pressing on his chest for months had loosened, not vanished, but eased. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a deadline. It felt like space. David didn't rush to fix everything. That surprised Barbara most of all. The money arrived quietly, deposited without ceremony, numbers changing on a screen that looked exactly the same as it had the day before. No music. No relief loud enough to hear. Just space. For the first time in years. David kept walking his route for another month. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to finish something the right way. He noticed things he'd been too tired to see before, the way one woman always waited behind the door until she heard his steps, the chalk drawings on a sidewalk that changed every few days, the way Charlie wagged his tail harder when David came home on time. Barbara watched him move through the house differently now. Slower, but lighter. Less guarded. You're not bracing anymore, she said one evening as they washed dishes together. David considered that. I think I forgot what it felt like not to. They helped Kevin quietly. No speeches. No advice he hadn't asked for. Just a transfer, a call, and the simple words David had always wanted to hear himself. You're not alone. Kevin cried. Briefly. Honestly. And then he laughed, embarrassed. I didn't know how much I needed that, his son admitted. Neither did I, David said. On his last day as a mail carrier, David stood alone in the depot after everyone had left. He set his satchel down on the bench, running his hand over the worn strap. 42 years of weight, carried a little at a time. He didn't take anything with him. At home that evening, David found the folded final notice in a drawer. He unfolded it once, looked at it without flinching, then tore it cleanly in half. Not in anger. In acknowledgement. Some endings didn't need drama. Later, David sat on the porch with Barbara, the Denver sky fading into deep blue. Charlie lay between them, breathing slow and content. You ever think about how close we were? Barbara asked. David nodded. Every day. And? And I'm glad I didn't trade the future just to survive the night. Barbara leaned her head on his shoulder. David watched the quiet street, the same one he'd walked past thousands of times without knowing how much it mattered. Faith, he realized, hadn't saved him by changing the world. It had saved him by keeping him steady long enough for the world to finally catch up. When the porch light clicked on behind them, warm and ordinary, David didn't feel like a man who had been rescued. He felt like a man who had endured. And that, somehow, felt even better.